doing as well. So thank you everyone for being here today. It is an enormous honor, enormous privilege to get to kick off this series in person for the very first time, and to have this incredibly illustrious and all-star panel of completely kick-ass leaders in our midst today. We are incredibly lucky to have them visit our school. We're incredibly lucky that they are here to talk with us, converse with us, and have a chance to really be a part of our community long-term going forward. We're very excited to set this link up today. So without further ado, I want to introduce our incredible speakers today. They really are just living legends in our midst. I'd like to kick us off, I guess, in alphabetical order. Dawn Diener, who is the head of the Choosing Justice Initiative. Dawn, as many of you might know in the public interest community, headed the Public Defender's Office in Nashville for around 2 decades.
1 decade.
One decade. That was not a statement of anything else. You look amazing. You look gorgeous. So Dawn headed the Public Defender's Office, and she set up Choosing Justice, I think, as a kind of epiphany that came to you afterwards in the kind of failures of our criminal justice system, where it's falling short, and the difficulties of indigent defense that the Defender's Office is seeing. Then we have the legendary Ms. Charlene Oliver, who really is a legend in Tennessee and Nashville, in the country. She is, basically every accolade, TEDx talk, you name it, she's done it. And she is the co-founder of the Equity Alliance, which fights for Black empowerment, Black political rights. And she's been active in voting rights and criminal justice, and sort of pushing for reform in the community in Texas, as well as nationwide. The Biden-Harris administration is recognized as one of the people that have been fighting for voting rights in the country and around our community. And then we have the inimitable Ms. Haynes, who is with us today. She is just an absolute legend. She stands before you today as a lawyer, an activist, someone who has been fighting for voting reform, criminal justice reform. And Ms. Haynes' story is remarkable. She did her LSAT in prison, I believe, right? As a federal inmate. And instead of doing clinic, she fought for herself before the Supreme Court to have a chance to reduce her sentence and to actually be recognized as someone who could join the practice of law. And here she is today as a public defender, as someone who is a leading light in our community, and she's an author of her book that details her experiences from prison to practice in the legal community today. So I'd like to invite our speakers to have a moment, and you are on Zoom as well, so there'll be other interactions as well. But to come and sort of say a few words, to talk about your experiences, talk about the challenges, and then I might ask you a few questions and get the audience as well to contribute. This really is a conversation, hopefully, that we can get to try and think about ways in which our school can contribute, as well as think about ways in which the challenge that you're facing and that we can interact with going forward. Dawn, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Good afternoon. As Professor Yadav mentioned, I was the public defender, the elected public defender in Nashville for 10 years from 2008 through 2018. Before that, I was an assistant public defender at the Nashville Public Defender's Office for 11 of 12 years of my career as a lawyer. And it's the only practice of criminal defense and public defense that I've ever knew before I became the chief public defender. And during my time as the chief public defender, I had the opportunity to learn about how things work in other places besides Tennessee, which was really eye-opening for me. As was just leading the office here in Nashville and coming to understand some of the greater systemic forces at work. When you're a line attorney as a public defender, at least in my experience, I worried about my individual clients a lot and did not spend a whole lot of time thinking about the larger issues of how did we even get to this place in our criminal legal system? What are the forces that brought the people I'm representing here into this jail or here into this courtroom? I didn't think about those things. I think today a lot of lawyers going into the practice of public defense are way far ahead of me in that regard, and they have thought about those things, and they are bringing those perspectives and the desires to change those systems in positive ways with them to practice. But that was not something I had done. So during my time as the chief public defender, what I came to understand so much more than I ever had before is that public defense was not set up to succeed. That it is part of an oppressive system that has been established, unfortunately, by lots of lawyers and judges, people who are in the same profession as me. And when I became a lawyer, I was really proud to be a lawyer. And I've really struggled with that over the last 5-7 years of the more I pay attention to what's happening within the larger system, the more I realize how responsible lawyers are for the oppression that currently exists and the ways in which law is used to oppress people. And not just any, like every people or any, but certain groups of people, right? Largely African Americans and people who've come from lower socioeconomic classes, right? So I eventually decided, as that epiphany, was that I needed to leave the public defender's office. I had been the head of it for 10 years and felt like I had done what I could to make changes there, to advance the cause of public defense. I think the most important thing, a couple of important things that it was focused on caseloads for public defenders and reducing the number of individuals who we were representing. In my experience, we said that our mission was to provide excellent representation to all of our clients, regardless of what they were charged with. But what we actually did was provided as good a representation as we could, given the volume of clients that we had. And that's basically allowing the system to provide as little as it will to the representation of poor people. And so public defenders, I think, really have been in many ways complicit with that oppression of that system. And it is why our clients call us public pretenders and why our clients and the communities from which they come don't trust us. I think the other realization that I started to have during my last few years there was, for a long time, I thought it was my clients who just didn't get me. And they just didn't understand that I was a good lawyer, went to really good law school. I really cared about the work that I did and I was pretty good at it. They just didn't get that. And I had this epiphany that, in fact, it was me who just didn't get them and what they were experiencing. And that until I really woke up to that and until I handed over that power to them, I was part of the problem. So I started Choosing Justice Initiative, and really what I wanted to do is a 501c3 nonprofit law firm here in Nashville. And really what I wanted to do was create a place where people who needed criminal representation in a criminal case, who couldn't afford a lawyer, could go to hire somebody of their choice. They can't hire somebody, right? They don't have any money. But the criminal legal system says poor people in this country don't have a right to choose who their lawyer is, whereas people with money have an absolute right to choose who their lawyer is. And I believed that the only way we would ever provide a service of quality representation that would be valued by the community we were supposed to be serving was if it was something they actually wanted. And the only way you know that somebody actually wants you is if they call you up and say, hey, I would like for you to represent me, or I've heard good things about you. Can you help me? And the only way you get that is that if you have individuals within the community who trust you and who recommend you. So that's really this kind of niche place that I started CJI, wanting to see, could we build a model where people could choose who their court-appointed lawyer was and build from there? And would that improve the quality of representation? Would it improve outcomes that clients received? And would it improve public confidence in the work that we were doing and in that service? And of course, I also want to do a whole lot of other things. And so it has this really broad mission of addressing wealth-based disparities in the criminal legal system here in Nashville, and beyond the quality of representation that people can receive. We also deal with issues related to bail reform. We provide representation to individuals in hearings, collateral hearings that they can't afford to hire counsel for and don't have a right to. So things like parole hearings, right? People with money hire lawyers to represent them at parole hearings. People without money are not entitled to a lawyer at a parole hearing. And so it's harder, once you're in the system, it's even harder to get out because you don't have money. Things like the sex offender registry. People who get stuck on the sex offender registry, they can't afford to hire lawyers to file lawsuits to say this is an unconstitutional ex post facto law. And a lot of those lawyers will require a retainer. So I wanted this big mission and I wanted the freedom to do all these things. And so I started this nonprofit. And that was 3.5 years ago, and we're still going strong. On that, I'll stop and turn it over to you, Charlene.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. I'm probably the only non-attorney or lawyer or law student in the room. So I am the co-founder of the Equity Alliance. We have been in existence for about 5 years, a little over 5 years. And I entered into this work kind of unconventionally. Most people who find themselves working in the political space or activism space, whether they've been groomed to do this or they've been trained by their parents who were maybe civil rights activists. I didn't have any of that. I didn't grow up with political connections. I grew up with parents who were taking me down to the courthouse and seeing, how voting is done or laws are made or anything like that. But I just grew up poor, and having that lived experiences really kind of drove me to understand why we need fairness, equity, and justice in this country. And so as I got, into the working world, my entire career has been about serving people. I've worked with all kinds of vulnerable populations. I've worked for the state of Tennessee as a caseworker. I've traveled across the state enrolling folks in health insurance. I've worked with families of incarcerated parents, kids whose parents are incarcerated. So I've kind of seen the gamut of people in crisis. That's kind of where I've always sort of been and worked in and served, is just working as somewhat of a social worker. But it wasn't until about 2012, I had already had a 9-month-old daughter, and found out I was pregnant with my son. And he was born, 2 days before Trayvon Martin was murdered. And when his murder happened, that really struck a chord in me, obviously, because now here I am with my first son, and seeing the world from a different lens. I've always kind of seen the work that I do, again, from a place of crisis and a place of, seeing how folks are always giving handouts in terms of charity, in terms of how we give out backpacks, for school, or whether it's food stamps or what have you, but really didn't take a look at, well, why is it that folks are in these situations? And so I really started to shift my perspective in my late 20s from charity to justice, and really started to question a lot of, well, how do people get in these situations? And that just kind of drove this compelling need to act. And if you remember, around the time of 2012, that is what sparked the Black Lives Matter movement. And so there was this series of incidents happening across the country where Black men and boys and even women were being murdered by police, and murdered by state-sanctioned violence, even by the government. If you think about the Flint water crisis, that was going on around the time, and I had this anger in me because I'm just sitting back watching this and questioning, how is it that an entire governor of Michigan can sit back knowingly have information that is poisoning his citizens and not give a damn because they're Black. Because, you know, most people in this country think that Black folks are disposable. And so I'm just sitting back and watching, you know, Dylan Roof kill 9 people in South Carolina in the church. And it just continues to happen, this injustice on Black folks. And this has been happening for centuries, right? And so I kind of questioned at this time. I was working at Meharry Medical College right down the street. And I wanted to get into the world of communications. I was in the nonprofit space, but really kind of in this self-discovery phase of my life and figuring out what am I good at, how do I turn on this anger? And so, you know, I just started questioning what do I do? How do I act? And didn't really have those tools available to me. I questioned whether I should go to law school. Actually, I'm still considering it, maybe. I don't know. Everyone's told me not to go to law school because there's so many lawyers. So just hire somebody. So y'all can come talk to me afterwards. You know, I questioned, do I run for office? Like, how do I make change? And so I said, let me just work on a school board campaign, just to kind of get my feet wet and see what it's like to work in politics. And so I worked on a Christian Bugs campaign for a school board. This was in 2016. And at the time, I'm working now as the communications director for the Williamson County Chamber of Commerce. And at this time, I didn't know what I didn't know, right? I was just trying to get a job in communications because that's the path that I wanted to be on. And they were first to hire me after 18-month search, not knowing that Williamson County is the 7th richest county in the country, richest county in Tennessee, most conservative county in Tennessee, and you know, has the best schools, you know, very affluent community. And I'm exposed for the first time to a lot of wealth and a lot of power plays. And I'm seeing, as if you all remember, Nashville at the time, 2011, 2015 is like in this boom, economic boom, still is. Nissan came here, and at the time, Alliance Bernstein was being recruited to come to Nashville. And I'm the only Black person that works in this entire company of like 20 people. So you can probably imagine all the microaggressions that I experienced. And that didn't help that I was already angry at the world and what's going on. But I was able to sit in rooms because I'm in middle management and sit in rooms with like Governor Haslam and all these CEOs who was talking about transportation and how do we fix our traffic in Middle Tennessee? How do we sustain this growth and all this economic prosperity? How do we keep our schools great? And I'm just sitting back like, my community ain't this great. Like, we don't have the best schools where I come from, you know, and just seeing how they live in this bubble that isn't reality, at least not my reality. So at the time, Christian Buzz's picture comes across my computer screen at work on Facebook, and it's an article saying she's running for school board. I didn't know her at all, but she was a young Black woman, and I wanted to help her. Again, I wanted to use my communication skills, and so found out we had a mutual friend. We linked up, and with her, this is her first time running for public office, and she's like, "I can know help I can get." I don't know. She's putting a team together. So this is where I made my co-founder Tequila Johnson on this campaign because Tequila is Christian's friend. She's serving as a campaign manager, and I'm the communications director. Christian's the candidate, and there's some other folks that came along the way. And between the three of us, we're just figuring it out, right? And so there are a lot of things that came out of this campaign that drove me to start the Equity Alliance. And there were a few things that really stuck out to me. First of all, Christian at the time was about 30 years old. And, you know, she has political connections because of she has a lineage in Nashville. Her grandfather was a state representative. Her uncle is currently representative here in Love. So she has some access. But a lot of the old Black guard told her not to run, and so that struck out to me, that even though she was the most qualified, she's Vanderbilt educated, she's been a teacher, you know, she's done all her research, they said, you're not qualified to run for school board. So that didn't sit right with me. The second thing is, you know, she was running up against a lot of money, a lot of PAC money. And at the time where I was at the chamber, I had heard this word again because the chamber was starting a business PAC. And so I'm sitting back really thinking about, wow, this is how a lot of the political game is done. Because again, I'm exposed to CEOs bringing big checks, you know, and I'm just seeing how money is used to influence politics. And that was the second thing that didn't sit right with me. And then the third reason was on this campaign, Christian's district, there's a couple of housing projects that is in her district. And if you know anything about campaigns, you know, they tell you where to go knock doors. And even though there was this whole housing project with all these registered folks, the campaign consultants that we were using, who were white, because most of campaign consultants are white dominated field, they were like, look, you know, we're trying to get super voters. And I'm like, what is it with super voters? We're just trying to get the folks who we know are gonna vote. So don't waste your time going to Casey Holmes project. And we just looking like, but they register, why can't we, like, you know what I'm saying? So that was the third thing that kind of stuck out to me, was this perpetuating belief that one, Black people don't vote. And we don't need to waste our time and resources on people who don't traditionally have a voice. So that was what kind of sparked the Equity Alliance movement. And 6 months, well, not even 6 months later, about 4 months later, summer of 2016, Donald Trump gets elected. So I was like, oh, hell no, we gotta do something. So, excuse my language. And literally about a week later, even though I had to go back to work, but all these folks I never voted for him because I'm just like, all right, we gotta do something. So send a text message to these women, and that's really kind of the history of how we started. Not having any money, we each put in about $250 of our own money to start a bank account, and we met on November 18, 2016, and my life has been different ever since. We decided actually to start two organizations that day, the 501c3, which is the Equity Alliance, and a Power to Impact, which is now transitioned into the National Justice League. So that's essentially what we do, is we disrupt the perpetual cycle of voter engagement. Conventional wisdom says, you know, if there's 10 houses on the street, then the people that you should go talk to are the 3 houses of people who you know are going to faithfully go vote. Well, for us, we want to talk to the other 7, because we believe that, look, if we put more people into the process, particularly people who have been shut out, put on the margins, whose voices have been silenced, then we can disrupt the systemic issues and address policy decisions by putting people up that will care about our issues. So that is essentially what we do. We fight against voting rights, fight for voting rights, and against one of the forms of white supremacy, which is voter suppression, and it's prevalent in Tennessee. When we started the organization, we didn't realize that Tennessee was 50th in voter turnout, and that is definitely by design. They don't not only want Black folks to vote, they also don't want Black and brown folks, they don't want immigrants, they don't want low-income folks to vote, they don't want disabled people to vote, they don't want college students to vote. Essentially, if you're not a white man, then you are not beneficial to the process. So we're here to make more people, advocate for more people to vote, but also to get policy wins for our communities to better the conditions of our community.
Hi, good afternoon. I am Keita Haynes, and you may be expecting Don Harrington, but I am Keita Haynes / Don Harrington today. So Don couldn't be here because one of our youth people that we have been working with in one of our youth programs, who was actually bound over in the criminal legal system and charged as an adult for a homicide, actually committed suicide in the jail just a couple of days ago. So that's a lot of stuff that we're dealing with at Free Hearts right now. So that's one of the reasons why Don Harrington couldn't be here. And I am the senior legal advisor at Free Hearts. And I have been working with Free Hearts ever since 2019. And as the professor mentioned, I am a former public defender. Don Diener was my supervisor when I worked at the public defender's office for 6.5 years. And, as she mentioned, yes, I have been to federal prison. Myself, along with 29 other people, were indicted here in the Middle District of Tennessee on various different marijuana and money laundering charges. I was the only person who chose to go to trial and to hold the government to their burden to prove every single element of the case. And I was acquitted of 6 charges and was found guilty of aiding and abetting a conspiracy to distribute 100 to 400 kilograms of marijuana. Now, in the federal system, that carries a mandatory minimum of 5 years. So I was in my early 20s in college, majored in criminal justice at Tennessee State University, and never had any exposure to the criminal legal system, but I was automatically looking at 5 years in federal prison. So the judge chose to sentence me to 7 years in federal prison. And as your professor mentioned, my attorney and I, we did work on that case. We appealed my case all the way to the Supreme Court. It was overturned, came back to be resentenced, and was resentenced again to the mandatory minimum at that time. So after serving almost 4 years in federal prison for a crime that I didn't commit, I was finally released. So I had become a statistic, but I refused to be a casualty. So I did study for the LSAT when I was in prison, and I went to National School of Law once I got out. Graduated, took the bar, started working at the public defender's office. And I met Don Diener, who is Don Harrington, who is the executive director of Free Hearts in 2016. And it was right after the national scene did an article about, my life and everything that I had been through entitled Beating the System. And so Don Harrington was working with the public defender's office around various different things. And so she was just adamant that she had to meet me. And so we met. And, I have been working with Free Hearts ever since then. Don Harrington, she created Free Hearts in 2015. And they have been doing amazing work. So Free Hearts is an organization that is run by directly impacted women. And so the work that we do centers around supporting and education and advocacy for families that are impacted by the criminal legal system. And so working as a public defender, I didn't feel as if my job was just to represent my clients in the courtroom. I felt that my representation went beyond that my representation started in the community. And so working with Free Hearts gave me the opportunity to do that. And so I was able to volunteer with Free Hearts around a lot of various different programs that they had, and was also able to volunteer and do some research with them around some of the legislation that they actually got passed in 2020 that was it was alternatives for incarceration for primary care parents. And so was able to do some research and help them with that. And then, you will notice a theme of, what Don Diener has said, what Charlene has said. What I will say is that, there's always this epiphany of I could be doing more, or asking the question why, right? And so for me, working at the public defender's office, kind of like how Don Diener said she became, got to that point, I could no longer do it anymore because I was a systems actor, right? So it was just we come into this work with the best intentions, right, to dismantle the system, right? But it's really hard to dismantle a system using the master's tools. And so, just recognizing that and recognizing that, that I'm a part of this, right? Even though this is not what, we set out to do, because of the way that the system is designed, we are a part of this. And so, you also start to recognize is that by your clients, by the time they get to you in the criminal legal system, there's so many other things that have gone wrong in their lives and that no one's talking about, no one's addressing. And so that was one of the reasons why I chose to leave the public defender's office in 2015 and I ran for Congress in 2020. Because, when you have, a client that tells you that they are, using one drug to get off another drug because they don't have the health insurance to go to, get the treatment that they need, that's a problem, right? you know, when, you know, you're seeing your clients who can't get jobs simply because of, you know, criminal records, and, you know, and you're seeing, you know, the school to prison pipeline and how, you know, we're underfunding schools, and, you know, and how this is all leading to that. And, you know, when you're seeing, you know, the housing crisis, you know, and people in communities of color, you know, are not able, you know, to afford, you know, housing and things. And so it's just like, you know, there's, like I said, there's so many other things that are going wrong. And I just felt that, you know, while we can address the issues in the criminal legal system, if we don't address these issues right here, then we can't ask why the recidivism rate is so high, right? Because we're not meeting the needs of people. And so, you know, I chose to run for Congress, and then, you know, I had a lot of people that were reaching out all across the country, because part of, you know, the platform was that I was someone that was directly impacted. And, you know, and so all kinds of directly impacted people across the country wanted to know how they could vote for me. I wasn't running for president, so they could not. But, you know, people wanted to know what they could do in their states, how they could get their voting rights back, right? And so at Free Hearts, what we did was that we partnered with various different organizations in the community. We partnered with, you know, several different NFL players to actually pay all fees and fines and restitution for people to be able to vote. And so we were able to do that for quite a few people in the 2020 election. And, you know, myself and, you know, Don Harrington and, you know, several other of us that work at Free Hearts, we know that, you know, this rights restoration process, that it is so confusing and it is so convoluted. And it's designed that, you know, just that, so that people will not want to go through the process to have their voting rights reinstated. So we, that was another part of Free Hearts that we created, was the Free to Vote. And so a lot of the work that I do at Free Hearts is centered around that. You know, right now in Tennessee alone, we have 450,000 people who can't vote because of felony conviction on their record. You know, Tennessee is number 3 when it comes to the number of African Americans that are disenfranchised, and we're number 1 when it comes to the Latinx population that's disenfranchised, right? So, you know, when we started looking at the history of voting and, you know, looking at all of the ways that, you know, Black and brown people have been, you know, kept from voting, kept from being able to utilize the voices at the polls, you know, all of those things have been, you know, found unconstitutional to, you know, the being grandfathered into, you know, the various different poll taxes, the literacy test. Everything has been held unconstitutional except for felony disenfranchisement. And right now across this country, we have over 5 million people who cannot vote because of a felony conviction on their record. That is the ultimate form of voter suppression. So that is the work that I do at Free Hearts. And, you know, there are other things that we focus on. We have participatory defense, so we also do a lot of work there. And so that is essentially shifting the power in the courtroom and giving the families who are impacted, you know, by incarceration, the opportunity to be able to say that they have the power in the courtroom, right? To be able to actually know what's going on in the criminal legal system, because a lot of people don't. And to be able to use that knowledge to be able to advocate for their loved ones, you know, in conjunction and sometimes, you know, separate from what their lawyers are actually doing, you know, because what you heard Don Dino say about how some people in the community feel about public defenders, you know, that is true, right? And so that is something that you know, that we do deal with. And so we do participatory defense. Free Hearts has expanded. Free Hearts has a base in all 95 counties in the state of Tennessee, which is something that, you know, we are very proud of, particularly with trying to do policy. Just this session, we had 2 rights restoration bills, one that focused on jail-based voting, because there are so many people who are sitting in jail who have not lost their right to vote. And so, you know, but they're not, you know, able to actually vote. And so you have the de facto disenfranchisement. And so we actually had legislation to create a polling location at the jail. And so, you know, we're still working on that because, again, we want to make sure that everybody that has the right to vote, that they're able to vote. And then we had our rights restoration bill as well, too. And again, like I said, Tennessee has a very, very convoluted process to get your rights restored. Tennessee is the only state that requires you to be current on your child support in order to get your voting rights reinstated. The only state in the entire country that does that. And then you also have to have completed your sentence, paid any fees, fines, and, you know, paid your restitution. So again, you know, this is a money thing, right? And so this is not an equitable system because you can have two people who have, been charged with the same thing, who have both completed their sentences, but you have one person who is poor, who can't afford to pay to participate in our democracy, and one person who can. And we don't believe that you should have to pay off the state in order to participate in our democracy. And so, that's one of the things. And so we actually made progress this time around with our rights restoration legislation. And actually looking forward to, working with some of the Republican legislators who we actually got them to agree this time around that it needs to change here in Tennessee, that there is something wrong, right? But it was interesting how it came about because last year they didn't care what we had to say. And again, it was interesting because last year the people that we had to come testify was all Black people, right? And so our legislature consisted mostly white people. And so, they have this misconception that this is something that felony disenfranchisement is something that only impacts Black people. So this year we brought a white lady who hasn't been able to vote because of a conviction from when she was 17 years old. That's not even a violent offense either. And she came and she spoke and she talked about being a social worker, a soccer mom, and all of this other kind of stuff. And when she got to the part where she said that she couldn't vote because of something that happened when she was 17 years old, they all looked up and they all started paying attention because it's just like, oh, this is someone that we did not expect this, someone to be impacted by this, right? And so again, so there's different strategies, that you have to use, in order to be able to advance this. But like I said, we did make progress. We're proud of the progress that we made. We have fellows that are working each and every single day that are helping people to get their voting rights reinstated. And so we have that. We just had this huge participatory defense conference in Memphis with, because Nashville is the main hub, and then there's a Knoxville hub, and then there's also a Chattanooga hub as well too. And so we're doing that along with, some other things. You may have seen on the news that Mindy Dodd just got released, and she was one of the females that we had been advocating for her to be released. And so, finally got her released. We are constantly in contact with the governor's office, asking him to use his commutation powers, to commute sentences for, people that have extreme sentences in the state of Tennessee. And so, one of the reasons that Free Hearts was created is just, again, because of all of our experiences in the criminal legal system and just recognizing that, Black and brown people are overrepresented in the criminal legal system. And, there is a difference with the needs that the women face in the criminal legal system than just the men, and wanting to just give voice to that. And just really advocate for, issues that are impacting women when it comes to them being involved in the criminal legal system. And so that was one of the reasons why Don Harrington decided to create Free Hearts in 2015. And it has, just continued to grow. And we're just really, really proud, of the work that we have been able to do over the last few years. And always looking for more people to connect with us.
I'd like to open it up to questions, and maybe I could, get things started as part of the conversation, which is just for you to maybe give us a lay of the land at present. We're seeing a new administration, obviously at the federal level, but at the state level, it does feel like things are becoming more restrictive in terms of voting, having a more difficult time in terms of gerrymandering, other restrictions that are coming in, a very tough posture at the governor's level in terms of signing off on extremely restrictive measures. How are you finding your efforts here in terms of gaining traction towards reform? Do you see the state and the legislature currently as just a complete roadblock, or are there some pathways that you can envision for pushing greater expansion of voting rights, improving the ability of former felons to get their voting rights? Do you see any hope for that, or is it just, fighting into the void?
So, yeah, we're an interesting state. Tennessee, I'm not gonna shoot, no, it's bad. It's real bad around here. Yeah, we're in a supermajority trifecta with our state government, and they abuse that power. I say they because they don't speak for me or represent my values, and essentially we are an economically depressed state, and they take advantage of these culture wars essentially, and they like to pass laws that address problems that don't exist, and so that is kind of what we're working with our Republican state legislature. And when it comes to voting rights, they have stopped any effort in its tracks to gain traction. This year, we proposed a bill to reduce the voter registration deadline, which takes 30 days. You have to be registered 30 days in advance here. And that is also a suppressive mechanism. We propose that timeline be reduced to 15 days to shorten that timeline and window to process voter registration forms, and that got shut down. So, they will justify any reason why we should not expand access to the ballot. And what we're seeing is a trend of laws being passed that are being adjudicated in the courts. So every law, I wouldn't say every, most laws here are unconstitutional and they're having to be challenged in the courts. For example, the Equity Alliance, we championed a lot of the redistricting process. We started with advocating and organizing for the census last year. And so we went into 4 different counties and made sure folks filled out that census and understood the importance of why that census is needed. But unfortunately, we advocated for fair maps. We were only one of 4 organizations that submitted a map to the state legislature for Congress, state rep, and state senate. And they claimed to have a fair process and an open process, but they waited until the day that the vote was coming to actually make their maps public, the Republican legislature. And so we are not working with a government that believes in transparency, fairness, democracy at all. And what they essentially did was carve up Nashville 3 ways for the first time in 200 years. And so Nashville has had 1 congressperson, and now we will unfortunately have 3. I'm in now District 7, used to be in District 5. And I was able to testify for why all the reasons that is wrong. And if you look at the maps, they did it with such surgical precision that they ran the lines right along all the Black neighborhoods. So they can't even make a case for why they did it the way they did. There's no other county in the state that has 3 districts, we're the only one. And so essentially they stripped the Black representation down from 30% to now 8, 15, and 12%. So we have effectively no voice in Congress, not even from a Democratic standpoint, but now an African-American standpoint. So gerrymandering is alive and well. We're actually getting ready to file a federal lawsuit. So y'all are the first to hear the news next week because of the way the maps are drawn along racially discriminatory ways. So it's hard, and we're having to fight again in the courts to get any type of victories. This is not our first dance and rodeo with the state, with the courts. We've sued the Secretary of State twice and won victories. The first time was in 2018 because they didn't like the fact that we were registering to vote Black and brown folks across the state, and we were able to submit 91,000 forms in 3 months for the 2018 midterms. And so they tried to criminalize our efforts by making it a felony and a $10,000 fine to make mistakes on form. So we had to challenge that in federal court as well as during COVID, providing absentee ballot access for every citizen so they can vote from home. They didn't like that too well, so they challenged that in court too. So everything that we've had to come by in terms of victories has to come through the courts right now. And so I would challenge you guys as you're going to law school we need more election lawyers. We need more of you going into election law. Right now, there's only like 1 or 2 lawyers in the state that we can call on to look at election lawyer. We get our representation from DC and DC firms because there's just not enough. And right now we're in such a dire fight for democracy, if it ever existed. But right now it's definitely on the verge of Black support because of at every turn there are efforts to dismantle our voices. So.
I would just say that, I had, the privilege of working with a national organization and focusing on rights restoration. And so there is a difference in the work that I do and the work that Charlene does, right? The work that I do is rights restoration for people who have been, formerly incarcerated, for them to get their voting rights reinstated, right? And I think the work that with Charlene, she'll tell you that the work that they do is just voter suppression in general. Which, it all falls up under voter suppression, but, I'm not an elections lawyer. That is not the type of work that we do, even though Free Hearts has worked with national organizations, Campaign Legal Center for one, in order to sue the state, but around the rights restoration process and around the certificate of restoration. But, it's interesting as we see voter suppression ramping up across the country, we also do see movements for rights restoration across the country. One of the things that we pointed out, to the legislature here is that, the Republican governor in Iowa, she issued an executive order to restore rights there. Now, of course, she issued an executive order because there was really no avenue for people that have been formerly incarcerated to get their rights restored. And so that was one of the reasons why she had done it there. There have been Republican governors that have done it in Virginia. And Virginia is an interesting state because you have one Republican governor that will issue an executive order, then another one will come back and will rescind that executive order. So that's for Virginia is very interesting. But, DC, just passed a law that said that you will never lose your voting rights. So if you are convicted of an offense in the state, in DC, then you can still vote in prison. And so that happens in DC, and that also happens in Puerto Rico, and you never lose your voting rights in Maine and Vermont. And so Biden did issue an executive order to make sure that people who do still have the right to vote in federal prison, that they're able to exercise their right. And those are conversations that I have been heavily involved in. We have another listening session about that tomorrow, because we cannot expect the Bureau of Prisons to actually do what they're going to do. And so a lot of community advocates act, we act as watchdogs, to make sure that people's rights are not being violated in federal prison. And again, making sure that people that do have the right to vote are able to vote. Several states did pass rights restoration, laws last year. Connecticut was one of them that allows people to vote while they are on probation and parole now. And so there are a lot of states that have actually moved in that direction that are allowing people to vote. It's interesting because I see this as a democracy issue, and some people will say that this is this is a criminal justice issue. This is a reentry issue. I don't care how you see it. It's an issue, period. And it's an issue that, that we all should, be talking about and that we all should be concerned about. And so, like I said, it's just, it's interesting because in some states, rights restoration is, it is a very political hot button issue. In some states, it's not. Some states, we're not able to move their legislation this time around because, we have this whole narrative across the country with, the rise in crime. And so, now we need to revert back to being tough on crime now, and so, having to combat that narrative, and saying, have we not learned anything, from when, the country decided that they wanted to be tough on crime 20 years ago, right? Like we can't take steps back. And so it's just like, we're fighting, one fight, but we're really fighting like so many fights, like all within one, which sometimes can be exhausting, but, we just continue to keep our eyes on the prize and what's important and, and just continue to do the work.
Questions? I can just speak if you can hear me. Yeah.
For the Zoom though.
Oh, okay, sure. Go ahead. There we go.
Okay.
First of all, thank you so much for coming to speak with us. This question is mostly for Ms. Diener and Ms. Haynes. Within the context of public defense work, do you think that there's opportunity to be an effective advocate within the system? And if so, how? Or would you encourage young lawyers to immediately skip that step?
I think absolutely there's opportunities to be effective advocates. I think that the systemic pressures that exist are different in different places depending upon how the system is structured. So for instance, here in Nashville, the public defenders are assigned to practice in a particular courtroom where there's one judge and 3 DAs. And so the systemic kind of pressures you start to feel when you're in that situation is, well, I have 10 clients in this court. If I advocate really fiercely for this one client, is the judge going to get upset with me and be retributive to my other clients? Or is the DA, if I accuse the DA of acting unethically in this client's case, is that DA going to stop making me any offers on my other cases? So those kinds of systemic pressures exist. And then of course, you also, you come to learn what you think a judge will and won't do. And so you maybe become a less zealous advocate because you've convinced yourself that you've watched this judge deny 50 of the last bail reduction motions you have filed. And so why are you filing the one for number 51, right? You just tell your client, this is a waste of my time. And that's not good advocacy. So I think you have to be able to resist those systemic pressures. I think to be able to do that requires a strong leader in the office where you are. Because I believe the leader sets the culture for the office. And I think that it can be really challenging. Well, it's not a thing. It is challenging to change culture. And there will be pushback from within, as well as from within the office, as well as from external forces. And so as a graduating law school student, I'd absolutely encourage you to go to a public defender office that has a good leader. And I would absolutely encourage you to keep your eyes open to what you see as a brand new lawyer that looks messed up to you, because it probably is. And to use your voice to call that out when you can and last as long as you can. But I think it's invaluable also just to be there so that you can learn how the system works. Like Charlene was talking about being in that opportunity in Williamson County at the Chamber of Commerce, right? The things that it opens your eyes to, if you don't have a seat at that table, you'll never know. So I think it can be invaluable to go to a public defender's office, even if you understand the restrictions of that system.
I mean, I would, public defense work is good work, right? And I always tell people that even though I'm not, practicing, I'm in the courtroom, I will always be a public defender at heart, right? So everything that I do, like I'm bringing that with me and I'm looking at it through that lens, right? So, so I would never discourage anybody from being a public defender, but what I would say is that you are going into an oppressive system, right? And so I think that it is important to recognize that, and particularly understanding like who the players are in the system, and understanding that particularly if you're not a Black person that's in the criminal legal system, understand your privilege in this system, right? And understand that and be willing to check that. And also be willing to recognize that you do have this power, but if you're wanting to come in here and if you're wanting to change the system, you're going to have to do something different, which means that you're going to have to be willing to give up your power in order to do so, right? And so just being honest with yourself within this, because it is so hard to get caught up in, like Dawn Dieter said, with the systemic pressures and everything that's going on there. And it is so hard for people to go into this and to think that, I'm doing good work, right? And sometimes, not really allowing themselves to still be accountable, in that. And so there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of, we have to constantly be doing self-reflection, right, when we're in this work, because I don't think that anybody goes into, any type of public defense work with the intentions of doing things bad or the intentions of causing harm, right? But if you are not checking yourself, if you're not checking your privilege, if you're not understanding that you're operating in a system that is oppressive and, in a system that is designed to uphold white supremacy, then you will tend to cause harm, in the system. Not that it's something that you are intending to do, but it's just because of the way that the system is designed, right? One of the things that I, tell particularly public defenders that are not Black people is that I read this one book and it was, this young white female, she was a public defender, and she came into the work, wanted to do great work, and she was doing great work, right? But it wasn't until she actually stopped and she did self-reflection, and she said that what she had become was that somebody was throwing babies out the window, right? And she was catching these babies, and she got really, really good at catching these babies, and babies were constantly being thrown out the window. She's catching them and passing them along, catching them and passing them along. And she said not once did she ever stop and ask, who's throwing these damn babies and why? And so I think that it's important that we, as we are doing this work, that we are constantly mindful of the system that we are working in. We're constantly allowing ourselves to be held accountable and, and make the necessary changes that we need to make so that we are not, causing harm or perpetuating, this system of oppression that we're in.
Thank you all.
Oh, hi, sorry. So I'm curious about what your takes on progressive prosecutors are, because I think
I can't do it.
okay, that's fine too. Well, just because I know, I think there are a lot of people here, like I have friends who may be going into prosecution after we graduate. And I think honestly, like part of their justification for that is that they're going to a progressive office, or like they intend to be progressive prosecutors. And I have questions about that, certainly. So I think from the side of public defense and your progressive points of view, I'd love to hear what your take on that is. Like, is it even possible to have a progressive prosecutor?
I'll start off and give Keita time to. And I would really love to hear Charlene's position on this as well. Is a progressive prosecutor better than a regressive prosecutor? Probably. I think that what I want to recommend is that everybody read a book called Until We Reckon. It's written by a woman named Danielle Sered, S-E-R-E-D, who is the founder of an organization in New York called Common Justice. It's a restorative justice intervention program for youth in, the Bronx or Brooklyn. But reading that book was the first and only time that I had ever thought, maybe I should go be a prosecutor. Because her entire perspective basically is that the criminal legal system as it exists is a complete failure that helps no one, that is rooted in racism and power and white supremacy in politics, right? So anything, I think what Keita said earlier, when you're using the master's tools, anything that continues to just perpetuate and hold up the existing structure is problematic and it is going to fail. So to say I'm a progressive prosecutor, I'm going to come in and use this system in a positive way, there's nothing positive about the existing criminal legal system. It is entirely punitive and it hurts us. And it is designed largely as a system of social control. Give me a progressive prosecutor who says that, and then maybe we can talk about it. But even progressive prosecutors are using the system for power. So I'll take a Larry Krasner over, somebody whose policy is let's lock everybody up. But I'm only going to do that with an understanding of what Larry Krasner's really about, right? And so I think a lot of people are really of the mind, a lot of activists are really of the mind that we're not going to make any progress unless we abolish the system as it exists.
All of them.
Yeah, any system.
I don't believe in progressive prosecutors. Progressive and prosecutors are two words that don't even belong in the same sentence, in my opinion. There's no such thing, in my opinion, as a progressive prosecutor. Even Larry Krasner is not a progressive prosecutor. Again, you know, I mean, like when you think of, you know, being a prosecutor and particularly, you know, this whole notion of being a progressive prosecutor, again, you are using the master's tools and you cannot use the master's tools to tear down the master's house, right? It is, you know, and as progressive as a prosecutor may want to be, they're still subject, you know, to outside pressure, right? Because for instance, let's take, you know, the prosecutor down in New Orleans, right? You know, there were people that left the public defender's office to go work with him, you know, and advocates that were doing, you know, juvenile justice work and everything. Like, you know, he said he wasn't going to do this and wasn't going to do that. And, you know, and it sounded really good. And he got into office and he did some things, you know, and it was great. But then they had, you know, some, you know, young offenders to, you know, allegedly commit a murder, and a murder of, you know, an older woman. And there was a lot of community outcry. And one of the things that he said that he would never do as a prosecutor is that he would not bind kids over to adult court. But he did because of all of the outside pressure, you know, that he was getting, right? And so, you know, I just don't, like I said, I do not believe in it. You know, there's that power structure there that I have a big problem with, you know, and then, you know, because it's already a power structure there. And then when you put progressive on top of it, it's just that I'm just a good person that has all of this power, right? But again, you know, how I said that, you know, you have to be willing to give up that power. And so I haven't met a progressive prosecutor anywhere that says, you know what, I have all of this power. And what I am willing to do is that I am willing to give up my power so that we can actually have an equitable system here. You know, like they're not willing to do that. It is all about power, you know, and that's one of the issues within the criminal legal system is the power structure within the criminal legal system, because you should not have just this prosecutor that is having all of the power, essentially holding all the cards, even more than judges, is what people don't even realize in this criminal legal system. And so I just, for me, it's a no for me. I mean, like it's a hard, fast no for me. I mean, you know, I am, and then if you even had someone that really wanted to do great things, right? Would they even have the funding to do it? You know, that's another issue, right? You know, would you really even have the funding to totally abolish the system and totally to reimagine what this is, where we're actually meeting people's needs with care and not cages? You know, so there's a lot of things that go into my ideology as to why I do not believe in progressive prosecutors. Now, if people want to go be prosecutors, you know, by all means, you know, that's, you know, if you think that you can do that and, you know, and you can do good work on that end, you know, I don't want to discourage anybody, but that is my personal opinion. You can check my Twitter, and every 3 months I will remind people there's no such thing as a progressive prosecutor. And right now, in this political climate that we have right now, I will remind people again that there is no such thing as a progressive prosecutor. And I will die on that hill.
Thank you all for being here. Can you hear me okay? I'm trying to phrase my question nicely, not to you, but more to the school. I think the law school really likes to bring speakers like this in, to have events like this that are all opt-in, learn about how messed up the legal system is, how the law is, but that's not what happens in our classrooms. Our school is full of these prosecutors, judges, the Republican legislators. Like, the school is full of people who are going to fill those positions of power, and they don't get exposure to any of this. And I just wanted to see if any of you could speak specifically to what the law school needs to do to try to improve things, especially in our criminal law classes. We're just taught punitiveness. And you shared like your experience, your lived experience with mandatory minimums. Like in our sentencing class, it's kind of like a game of, oh, what should this person get out of an option of a term of years? And people will say like 15 years without ever having like even talked to someone who's been incarcerated or having any other options that aren't incarceration, just as an example of kind of the common discussions in our classes. So I just wanted to see if you could speak specifically to the law school and if there's any administrators in here as well.
It's a really good question. I think that has a lot to do with who a law school recruits to come to faculty. And how they're investing in faculty, right? What kinds of compensation packages are they offering to which kinds of individuals, and who are they recruiting? I also think that supporting clinical programs is a really important thing as well. I've long thought that the third year of law school was a useless waste of time and a great money-making opportunity for law schools. And I believed that the third year, if you're going to have a third year, that it should be practicum, just like, you know, residency for a doctor. It should be practicum, and it should be required that it not be in a for-profit setting, right? That it be in real world settings, working with real people who need legal services. But how do you convince the capitalistic private law schools to engage in that? I don't know the answer to that, right? I mean, I think that again, when we talk about systems, this system is rooted in white supremacy and racism. It's also rooted in capitalism, and those two things are intertwined and have been since the founding of this country. And it's why money is so important. So those are my lame suggestions.
I just want to make an observation. It's Women's History Month. It's still Women's History Month, right?
Still got about another.
It's Women's History Month, and you have a panel of women. And the Maryland Law School is probably one of the most well-funded departments here. And we're doing this on our own time for free. And I just wanted to call it out. That is not equity. And so I just want to challenge you guys to consider that. As people who are on the ground, I consider myself a practitioner. I don't operate in theory, I operate on what actually happens in the real world. And we are tired, we are exhausted, we are doing the ugly work that no one else wants to do. And we are often doing it without compensation. And so that needs to be more valued. We value in this capitalistic society professions that, again, don't get to justice, equity, and undervalue the roles that actually do that. So just wanted to make that.
Yeah, that's good. Also, too, I would say that the fact that you've asked this question, you've recognized, you know, where there's a gap there. And, you know, sometimes you have to stand alone, right? Sometimes you have to advocate, you know what I'm saying, to have some people come in that's going to bring a perspective. So, you know, use your voice, you know, to do that. So, you know, go and talk to your professors and be like, hey, you know, like, I appreciate, you know, like what you told us, but, you know, like I've heard, you know, that there are some other people in the community, there's some other organizations, you know, that's doing this work, and maybe we can get a real life perspective of what this actually is, right? Instead of just, you know, a calculation of what this is in a book, right? Because you know, yeah, you know, when we're talking about sentencing, when we're talking about sentencing guidelines, you know, whether it's, you know, a state scheme or whether it's, you know, the federal scheme, right? You know, when we're talking about, you know, crime and punishment, you know, I think it's important that we put faces with that, right? Because it's one thing to read about it in a book, but it comes to real, you know, when you actually see you know, what the impact of that is, right? Because you can have a class and you can say, you know, Mr. X committed this offense, and these are the guidelines for Mr. X. Like, what sentence should Mr. X get? You know, well, according to Mr. X's, you know, the offense that he committed, according to, you know, his past criminal history, you know, this and the other, Mr. X should get X amount of time, you know what I'm saying, you know, in prison and jail. But until you bring in Mr. X and Mr. X tells you, again, that why, because we don't talk about that why. We don't talk about why people do the things that they do, right? You know, because when we do talk about that, then we uncover, you know, all of, you know what I'm saying, these issues within every single system, not within just the criminal legal system, but within every single system, right? And we see that, you know, that a lot of these things that's bringing people into the criminal legal system, like they're codified, right? You know, and so it opens your mind up to so much more than Mr. X committed this offense, his background. It says how much time should Mr. X get, right? You know, it makes it a reality. It puts a face, it puts a name, you know, to Mr. X, right? And so then you say, well, you know what? Mr. X was raised in poverty. Mr. X saw his dad commit suicide. Mr. X's mom has 3 other kids in addition to him, and she's working 3 jobs just to put food on their tables, right? So that leaves Mr. X to be able to be, you know, the caregiver for his 3 young siblings, right? You know, Mr. X can't even pay attention in school because he is trying to provide for his younger siblings, which he should not be doing, but that's what he's having to do because Mr. X's mom is working 3 jobs to provide for them, right? So you start to get a full picture, you know, of who Mr. X is. And you're just like, oh, well, okay, well, maybe it says that he should have this, but because of all of these other things, maybe if we met these needs with Mr. X, then we wouldn't even have a Mr. X in the criminal legal system. And so I think that, you know, it's important to see that. And it's important to see things in a perspective other than, you know, this punitive perspective, right? Because that's what the criminal legal system is. That's what it is. That's what it's designed for. And so we've got to start thinking differently. But if we don't see differently, then we're not going to think differently.
One quick question.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. This has been very insightful. Really quickly, kind of on the theme of isolation that you all have all touched on, how isolated this work can be, and even in the context of law school, how perhaps sometimes some of these conversations can be isolating as well. I'm wondering if you have found people along the way who have been willing to be allies to you, who otherwise you might think of as very rank and file. If not, is it your belief, I'm just curious how you approach the work, is it your belief that, you know, really this is work that you've committed to doing in a silo? Or do you find it a good use of your energy to kind of always keep the door open for people who, you know, might have a revelation and want to be supported for? This is more a question of just, you know, what you find to be a really good use of your energy as you're pursuing work that's really difficult.
That is a question that needs a whole hour.
I will say that, you know, the work that we do, you know, yes, you know, allyship is great, right? But we're looking for co-conspirators. You know, we're looking for people that's going to lock arms with us, you know, and that takes a lot, right? That doesn't take, you know, just reading 1 or 2 books in order to be able to do that, to understand what the issues really are, and to make sure that you're not bringing harm, you know, into these spaces, right? And so, you know, the people that we like to work with, we make sure that it is people that understand that. It is people that that's willing to give up their power. People that's willing to listen to Black women, and particularly Black directly impacted women, particularly when it comes to the work we're doing, because it's centered around, you know, criminal justice reform, right? And so those are the types of people that we're looking for. You know, yes, people do have epiphanies, right? You know, like, you know, because we're all changing and, you know, we're all evolving, and that's what it's about, right? You know, my thought process from 10 years ago was not the same that it is now. And so I think we do have to give space for people to grow and to learn. We have to give people the grace to do so, because we want that same grace extended to us. But also too, we have to protect our people in the process, right? Because I'm not gonna let you come into this space and you're gonna do harm here. Let's look at some things. Let's talk about some things. Let's make sure that, that you're really rooted and grounded in some things and that you're rooted and grounded in this work. And then, we can bring you in, because one of the things that we don't want to do is that we are very careful with making sure that our work is not co-opted, right? Because you will have people that will say that they want to help and they will take your ideas and, and then they're going to, make them their own, or they will want to tokenize, certain, Black people in these spaces, right? And so in welcoming, people in that may not have these lived experiences, we are very mindful that, yes, we will welcome you in, but we're going to protect our people first.
So, I think one observation I have is how incredibly courageous and hopeful you are. And how you find the strength to keep that hope going is something which is incredibly inspirational. I think a lot of us would have given up where you have kept going and standing up not just for yourself, but for other people. And that takes just enormous amounts of grace and inner power that you have as individuals, as people, as well as obviously professionals in this space. So I think we have learned a lot. At least I've been enriched both from the ideas that you have brought, but also from you as people. And the kind of energy that you have is something that is incredibly inspiring and humbling for all of us to have and to learn from. So thank you so much for being here with us today, for teaching us, for giving us the opportunity to learn from you. So thank you so much for making that time with us today.
Thank you.